for the new Power BI logo.
Yeah, that's our new logo. I haven't implemented it everywhere. I have an issue with my designer because it's too big. But yeah, welcome all and welcome Reid. Thank you so much for joining us to today's meeting in Power BI User Group Denmark.
Absolutely.
Some housekeeping rules. Please remember to mute yourself during the presentation. You can ask questions using the chat, and depending on what Reid prefers, whether we'll take the questions during the session or at the end, yeah, Reid can decide that. We will be recording the meeting. I'll post the recording on our YouTube channel later today or tomorrow morning. But first, I will do some promotion for the next events in our user group. The next one is June the 8th, where Charles Sterling, or Chuck, from Microsoft will do a presentation on the new Power Automate visual. That will be fun. Chuck is always a pleasure to to have as a presenter. And then I'm planning to do another session in June with the introduction to the new Chaticulator visual, and where Mike Carlo will present and give us an introduction on what we can actually use. And then we have a secret event. I can't disclose what the content will be because that's a secret, but reserve the August 23rd, where we will have an event. This will be in Danish, so any non-Danish speaker will probably have an issue with participating, but yeah, all Danish and everybody else who wants to learn some Danish and some Power BI will be welcome. But now I will leave the stage to Reid, and once again, thank you for taking the time to present, Reid. So take it away.
Perfect. Let me go ahead and share my screen. There we are. Too many windows. Okay. Can you make me a organizer?
Absolutely.
Looks like I need to be promoted. I love that you have all the extra touches. Even your background for your video is the Power BI community rocks right above it. That's great.
Yeah. Let's see. Here we have Reid, make a presenter.
Beautiful. I see it now.
Yeah, great.
Screen 2. There we go. Okay. Great. And you can see my screen?
I see it.
Perfect. Yeah. Just as I mentioned, by the way, Chuck's awesome for anybody tuning in. He's actually the reason I have my MVP. He sat me down one day and just told me he was nominating me, and he did that at his desk at Microsoft 3 years ago now. So he's one of my favorite people at Microsoft. He has the ability to remember a name for a person he saw once at a conference like 5 years ago, and then somehow still remember their name 5 years later when he runs into them. It's very special set of skills. But I digress. For this, I'm really happy to be showing you a bunch of cool and interesting techniques in Power BI. I kind of consider this to be, for those of you who have ever either read or seen, like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, they have a piece of candy called the Everlasting Gobstopper. And that's a candy that every time you try one, it always has a different flavor. It's kind of like with this presentation as well. A lot of my content that I create, and one of the reasons that I have an MVP is I do a lot of video production for YouTube, tutorials and things. And this is kind of a grab bag of a lot of my favorite things that comes out of Power BI when it comes to creating unique visuals, kind of unique ways to use visuals that just come out of the box within Power BI Desktop, some custom visuals. It's just a lot of kind of fun upgrades and enhancements for reporting and design. So it's something that, as I continue to produce more content, it changes every year. So in 12 to 24 months, if you saw this presentation again, I would guarantee that probably 70 to 80% of the content in here will be new. It's something that just constantly evolves. So it's one of my mainstay presentations that I like to continue to deliver. I'll go to here. Just a little bit about myself. So I have been in the BI space for about 8 years now. I started my business about 6 years ago, and I've had the privilege to work full time under it for the last 4. And as you can see there at the top, my avatar, which is the VizWiz, something that I've kind of fallen into as a specialty is I've just found that I have a bit of a knack for design and aesthetics. I see a lot of reports and models out there that have really good data, but just fall a little flat on how it looks, even not necessarily using the right visuals, too many pie charts and waterfalls and other stuff that honestly confuse rather than enhance the data. So that's kind of where I've leaned in as a specialty, both in my presentations and the work that I do with clients, is really just making sure that not only is the data good quality and is correct, but it's presented in a way that makes sense, that it tells a story, has some kind of a narrative, and that kind of translates with pretty much all of the work that I do. Now today, for this, again, because this is kind of a grab bag of presentations on a bunch of demos and everything else, it can be scaled up and down. Given our time, we probably won't hit everything on this list, but this is something that I have built out to. I can do a 30-minute talk on this. I can do probably a 2.5-hour talk on this, depending on how much time is available. But we'll go through a lot of really cool things and things that aren't covered as well. I will have a link to my PDF that will also have hyperlinks as well to consume this content in other places for some of the other demos that you see listed in here. But we will get through as much as we can. And then at the end, I will have some references and links, like I said, for you. But overall, this will be primarily demo driven. So I'll go ahead and exit out of this and switch into just talking about some really cool things in Power BI. There we go. Now, this is actually one of the ones that I've had in this presentation from day one, and it still will be in the Power BI presentation probably until Microsoft updates this. And there's actually a few of these techniques that I present, not necessarily because the concept is advanced, but because the implementation in Power BI is a little tricky, or it's nuanced enough that it's kind of like a hidden feature in a way. And this is one of them. It's been around. I've known of this technique for at least 2 to 3 years now, and it's something that still hasn't been updated completely to be able to make it really easy for people to implement. So if you look here, all the little KPI conditional formatting icons that are on here, those are things that can be added to a line chart, but you will not find this feature available directly built in to the format option. If you actually come down to data colors, typically what you would see in here is an f of x symbol that is in the right corner, but the problem with that is you don't see that in the line chart. Other visuals have that, but there's nothing in here to add any kind of color logic to the visual itself. Now the trick comes from kind of a happy accident that I stumbled across. When I had this, one thing in Power BI that's really useful is that you can start from another visual and you can quickly swap them around. Just to give you kind of an example, zoom out a little bit, I can very quickly just swap this with other types of visuals. So I had actually started with a column chart, and there is an f of x symbol down here in the corner that allows me to actually apply color logic to the bars. So it doesn't really matter what the logic itself is in here. This is just basically the percentages for the bottom, middle, and upper, but translated, when this gets converted to a different visual, in this case, the line chart over here, what that does is it takes them and it converts them from the bar colors, and it adds dots on the top in here. Now, I will say that these kind of situations where you come across something and you might even pause and think like, wait, is this a bug or is this a feature? In those cases, it really is something that you want to then consider deploying, or at least letting the customer be aware that like this is something that I've discovered, but it may or may not be stable. I did the due diligence, and thankfully I have a short line to Microsoft, so I emailed the product team and asked them, is this something that will get patched or removed? Especially now that you're aware of it, that I've informed you this exists, and they did tell me that it's not going to go away. It is. Ideally, someday they'll add an actual icon over here to let you modify it directly in a line chart, but this will not be removed if you publish it to production. So it's a safe implementation, and it's not something that will at any point break in the future. There are a couple of pros and cons to this. The pro, obviously, is that you get the color icons that show it on all of these spaces here. You can't customize the size or the shape, though. I could not turn these into diamonds or squares or triangles. And I can't determine how large it is. That basically is just determined by scale with the actual visual itself. So a couple of limitations as far as the customization. But if you're wanting to create bands or anything else that just kind of helps to show quadrants or sections of data as far as any type of logic that you're applying with KPI colors, it's a really useful feature to be able to implement that way. You just, essentially, if you ever need to edit it or change the logic, you just need to go, put it back to a clustered column chart, edit the logic in here, and then convert it back to the visual itself. And what I'll do is I'll do one more demonstration and then leave space open for questions as necessary. So I'll go through one other and then give us a little bit of time for that if needed. So another thing that's also just paired with this, kind of outside of any specific visual, but there's one of my favorite things that was implemented. The feature is great. Again, the location and the ability to add this, I think, is a kind of one of those nuanced scenarios that I mentioned. But I love that they added visual header tooltips a few years back to visuals in Power BI. You used to have to do this with bookmarks and a lot of really clunky, invisible and hidden objects on the page where you'd have to add these one at a time, create the bookmarks to get them to pop up. If the visual moved, then you'd have to move the items as well. And it was not an easy implementation. So there's a couple of things that I'll show you. First, just how to turn it on, which again, I think is a little bit buried in the menus. The second thing is how to get around a character limit, and you are limited to the number of characters that are available in the default visual header tooltip that's up here. I just have standard generic text that's auto-generated that's pasted into there. But generally speaking, the goal of this is to provide some context or information about the visual itself to maybe help explain the data or the type of visual that's being displayed. Now, with almost everything that you see in here, most of the menus have an on or off switch next to the menu. Even the visual header itself has just an on or off switch. Now, my preference, if I had designed this, is there should be, this menu is always on with an on or off switch just right here to turn on or off the visual header tooltip. For some reason, though, they decided to build this as conditional. So the only way this ever shows up on a visual, you have to first come to here, and then you need to scroll all the way down to the bottom and you need to turn this on. Now, I don't know about you, I definitely like to go through and just see all the menu options for most visuals. I don't think the average developer probably does that because there's so many submenus in here. So if you don't really think to go to the bottom of this menu in here and look for that, it's something that can be very easily missed. So again, it's great feature. I just think it could be a bit more visible as far as people knowing that it exists and not have to turn it on to get the actual menu down here to pop up. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention, again, is the character limits that you have. By default, you have 250 characters that are allowed to be put into here. No more than that can be added at any point. You also don't have that much formatting that's available to do any of the stuff that's in here. You have en masse, meaning all the text, you can choose the color, size, font, but I can't individually underline. I can't choose the alignment or anything else. It's going to be right aligned, and I have to just format the entire text all at once. Now, if I want to get around that, meaning I want a larger character limit, or I want a bit more rich text formatting, what you can actually do is you can attach it to a report tooltip page. So the page here, if we come down, that is a hidden page for information tooltip. And just like any other tooltip page that you created before that have been around for a few years in Power BI, similar process happens here. But instead of creating a tooltip that is going to be used for any of the actual like chart bars and that basically is taking filters from the visual itself, this page is designed entirely just to supply the visual header tooltip. The downside is, if you have 5 visuals that need some type of custom one, you have 5 hidden pages. But by the time the end users experience it, they're not going to know the difference. So I just built this out. It's literally just a single tooltip page with a similar colored background. But now, because I have a text box, I have the freedom to be able to choose my alignment. I can do the bold and underline if I need to for certain words. So I have full customization over this. I could add a logo in the corner if I wanted to. So this allows me to go around any limits that the native ones have. If I need something a bit more feature rich or dynamic as far as what I'm wanting to display when I have this icon that I'm hovering over to get some information for the visual itself. So it's a great feature, and I'd say don't necessarily build a page out unless you have to. Most of my visual header tooltips that I create usually just have a couple of sentences that explain something about it in the standard one. But this is nice as needed if you have something that needs to be a bit more feature rich, and you basically need you want a canvas to design it a little bit prettier or just with a few more words. Now, for the first 2 things that I've demoed so far, either with the visual header tooltip or with any of the conditional formatting icons or dots that I have on the visual, are there any questions before I move on to the next demo? If not, I will go ahead and switch to the next one. And I will mention, if you have a question, you're welcome just to come off of mute as well. I don't have the chat window up, so it'll be easier if you just pop off of mute if needed.
Or raise your hand. I have, and then I'll stop you.
Perfect. All right. All right, Eric, just for logistics, just what's the hard stop, by the way, for timing, just so I can monitor.
I have scheduled the meeting to end at 7:30.
Okay, so that's
so
40,
1.5.
45.
You have 80 minutes in total.
Okay. Perfect. I'll probably do about another 50 minutes to an hour presentation then, and then the open conversation and everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right. So here's another one that I really liked, and this actually allowed me to come up with a really interesting solution for a client scenario. And it's actually one of the reasons that I love to develop continuously today, because there are so many scenarios that I get where a client comes up and is, hey, I want this thing built, and I would never have thought of creating this thing myself, but it gives me unique ideas both to make, and then as needed, a lot of these translate to, like, this would be a great topic for a video. This was an example where a client wanted to toggle something like this that doesn't really matter the action that it's doing. It's just changing between visuals. But I basically created a bookmark that is kind of like a radio toggle that can move back and forth. And I originally thought about doing this maybe using images, or something else that can be brought in to the report itself. But I actually was able to create this entirely just using the native buttons. It doesn't actually look like a standard button at all in Power BI, but through a bit of the formatting, because they're highly customizable, I was able to create something that basically had that sliding effect back and forth. So I want to walk you through this. Come over here. What I actually have is two of them, and this is with any button that I generally create in Power BI. I usually have them with an active and inactive state, so you can kind of see them when they've been turned on with the bookmark or basically turned off, and that's what I've done here. The buttons on this first page are just two of them layered on top of each other. When I activate it, one of them hides, the other one becomes visible, same with the chart. So it creates the effect of having it move from one side to the other. So let me dissect this button itself and kind of walk through all the formatting that I used to get this effect. Here, and move this out. So we have a couple of things and settings in here. Now, the great thing with buttons is that there's actually a series of settings available for them with different states. We have our three primary ones that are used: default, hover, press. So default is, what is it when it's sitting on the page? Hover, what is the effect when my mouse hovers over it? And on press is when I click it. So all three of those back and forth together, those create three different environments of three different statuses for the button itself. That gives some kind of an effect that can change as you have default, hover, and press. And that's actually what I've done in here. Is the default has a right alignment. On hover, goes to the center, and then the right one, when I click it, goes to the left. Now, the actual symbol that you see into there is something that comes from the actual emoji keyboard on Windows. So I need to zoom out for this because my zoom tool does not like this pop-up window. But if I do the Windows key and semicolon, I get a pop-up for basically an emoji library from the Windows computer. And if I look for circle, there you go, it gives me everything that has a circle in it, including this white circle, which ended up looking perfectly like a little dot that is in the button itself. So I ended up using that one and putting that in to basically represent the little slider toggle. I could have just put a black dot, like a black period or something else in there. But this is one that, or a bullet, but this is something that I thought just added a bit of aesthetics as far as it having a black outline, white inside. Now, I will say, as a one word of caution, is this emoji library with any of these types of colored emojis that are not just like black and white ASCII characters, they do look a little bit different on various machines. So like the smiley face here, the one for Windows and the one for Android, the one for Apple, they all have that smiling face, but the actual library for them is a different artist, and they look a little bit different. So that's just one thing to just be aware of when you're doing this, is when you have when you're using these in here, that you need to just know what devices these are being consumed on, because there's a chance that it somebody's consuming it with a different operating system, the symbol might change just ever so slightly. And if that's something that's a very strict policy that they need to look a certain way, it's just a very small caution around that. But otherwise, the other things that allowed me to kind of get the shape out here was the outline and fill, and a very important one that's in here. So the rounded edges that I have here at 20, if I actually put that back down to 0, it just turns back into the regular square. So I created the look of the slider by basically rounding the edges on the outline, making sure that the color changes. So again, I basically start with blue and I go to purple. There's a blue on the right, the on hover is kind of a neutral gray, and on the left side is going to be a purple. And almost the exact same logic in here for the fill. And between all of these, you've essentially created the effect of some type of a button that allows the kind of toggling back to forth between it. And basically creating an effect in there. But I think this is just a great example of, again, how highly configurable the buttons are in Power BI, and the fact that your text can be symbols and a bunch of other stuff. So it really moves beyond just simply having a button that's a square that says, you know, action A or bookmark A that's written in there. You can make things that look more like something you would find on a website or any other kind of design environment that has a bit more of the aesthetic polish put onto it. For this though, are there any questions on kind of how I made this this button?
No questions.
Okay.
Pretty cool trick.
I was very happy when I figured out how to make this without needing to use custom images that I have to import. And when I say that, by the way, just to mention people, you have an option in your fill to add an image. It basically just means that the background of the button becomes that. So if you remove, you know, all of your other formatting, remove the text, like remove the colors, just completely make that empty. What you can then is you can add an image. And I was originally thinking of basically creating this, maybe in like Photoshop, and creating the 3 different images in there. But that also means the file now has to store the images, and they don't always render pixel perfect. Sometimes they're a little blurry as they scale up or down. So that was the thing that I was trying to avoid, and which is why I was happy I was able to figure it out just using the default formatting without having to make my own custom image.
There's a question in the chat whether you could do it vertically as well.
I think so. Let's do a live demo and find out. Oh, there it is. Okay. Like that. And instead, get rid of this. The default state, I want them all to be here, and then top, middle, there we go, press bottom. And probably have it a little bit shorter. Yep, there you go.
Nice.
Yeah, again, I love the fact that, and I really wish the single value card in Power BI has this. Like I do not understand why you don't have alignment for that. And like that's honestly, I have used these card buttons before as cards. You'll see in a later demo. I've used them for many ways as a visualization, purely for the fact that this does not exist on any other type of card, and it blows my mind a little bit, because you don't always want center aligned. Sometimes you want left or right, and it seems to be a very basic feature that is missing from specifically this visual right here, the single value card. I use it quite a lot, but it's very limited in how much you can customize it. And unfortunately, there's no options in here if you added data to do any kind of alignment. So buttons, in a ironic sense, actually make a better visual sometimes than the actual card visual does. All right, I'm going to close out of this. And there we go. This is another fun one. Okay, so this here is actually demonstrating something that came out last fall, which is the smart narrative visual. It's something that allows you to basically create a hybrid in a text box where you can not only type in static text, but you can combine it with measures, data that can change from your model. In this case, if you look at all the values that are underlined, they are all going to change as I change the hover in here. It's telling me some information about sales and some percentages. I also have something that's returning the top selling product. Let's say kind of a great copy paste formula from SQL BI. But either way, it's showing you good examples of a measure that is being combined with text that's been formatted, underlined, bold, italicized. Lots of really good ways to present this, and it allows you to then not only provide a visual in a sense, but it also just helps you provide some plain English explanation or just a plain written explanation of the data that's behind it. So I want to walk you actually through a couple of unique and clever uses from the 3 different visuals that you see on this tooltip, as well as the smart narrative, which is kind of the feature of this specific demo. I'm going to come over here. And what I'll do is I'll start by just working my way from the top down. For those who might not have created a report tooltip before, there's just a couple of settings that need to be done for that. On the page itself, when you create a new page, you just need to make sure that the page information, that tooltip is turned on. That basically classifies it as a tooltip, and it allows you to go to any visual and say, hey, for my tooltip, show this page. Otherwise, the only other thing you need to configure is you just need to determine your page size. By default, the tooltip is 320 by 240 pixels, so it's a nice little like 4x3 square. In this case, I went custom because I needed it to be a bit taller to fit a few more things. But what it does is you want the tooltip page to be small because it renders 1-for-1. So if you were to have, as an example, a 1280 by 720 tooltip, most of your page is going to immediately disappear behind it when you try to hover over it. So you want something small and card-like on that page. But let's walk through each of these pieces that are here at the top. This top section is, again, the example from like last time that I was just mentioning in the previous demo. It's a button. I use buttons for a lot of things besides actually activating bookmarks. They're so customizable that they work in a lot of different scenarios. And again, the number one thing that I appreciate about buttons is the fact that they have alignment in here and some other configurations. And the great thing about the text, whatever's displayed on it, it doesn't just have to be static text that's in here that's typed in. Instead, you can actually tell it to use a measure. I'm going to go back. I'm going to open this up. So there's an option in here to say show by field value, which just means use a measure in my model. And I have something called smart narrative title. So I'm going to show that here. And it's actually pretty straightforward. It's just brand with a space. And I just use the max function. Max, by the way, can also return text. Min max on any column that is textual based, it's alphanumeric. Min would return, the first thing that's either symbol or A, and then max for Z. But in this case, it doesn't actually matter whether or not I used min or max. All that is just harvesting one value from that column. But the filter context is what's determining it, because I want to be able to show them when you're hovering over it, what brand are they hovering over, what class are they hovering over. But because there's only one, it's a one-to-one relationship. So it's a one-to-one connection when I'm providing these filters to that, and they're propagating, because when I'm hovering over this element of this visual right here, there is only one brand name, which is Contoso, so that's going to show up, and this right here for the legend, again, there's only one class per section, so the min max doesn't really matter. The only goal is that it's just returning that text value as I hover over this, and I just wanted to make it clear on the tooltip whatever filter context is currently being applied to the information below it, just to make sure that there's no ambiguity and to really just provide a clear picture in there. So that's why I put that little title banner there at the top. All right, back to this. A couple of other things that I provided into here. Again, this is just a text box that now has a couple of items where you can actually add value. You can look at the ones you've already added in there. But the nice thing with any of these is, this is standard text that can be bolded or not. I can underline this or not. I generally have a couple of patterns that I like to apply. So far, I found that it kind of works that anytime I'm kind of referencing some type of a value, I usually bold the name of the metric that I'm showing, so total sales. And in this case, I underline anything that changes, because I want to call out the metric names to a degree. I also want to call out the items that are in the list that are going to change, and I have the ability to do that. When you're editing here, anything that's underlined with the green is a value that you've harvested from your model. So I'll show you how to add one of these. This, to give some context, is total sales for this month, and this is actually one useful thing that's can be implemented from the Q&A. So I'm going to delete that. I'm going to select add value. Now I will say that this is an okay developer environment. Honestly, I would love just to be able to take a measure from my model and just drag and drop it. Like the Q&A feature in Power BI is very much a consumer feature. Developers do not want to build a model with Q&A. I can't imagine a single person, I'm sure Eric included, who would want to have to build out every visual using a Q&A search function to find the measure name. That is, it's designed for consumption of data and to build unique visuals. But so I'm hoping at some point they update the ability to use this to make it a bit easier, so I can literally just drag and drop into the wells and add the visuals that way, or add the calculations that way. But for now, that is something you have to do. So if I was to look for total sales, there we go, and it starts to pop up like values, but in this month. So if I do that, it actually will take my total sales measure and then apply based on my calendar date for my calendar table. It adds a filter on top of it. So I can even show you this in process. If I just do total sales for now, there we go. There's a value that returns down here. Total sales this month, just like that one, you'll notice that the value now changes. So it gets smaller, and you can see that filters are being applied to it. So it's not creating a measure in your model, but it is allowing you to build it out this way. And I'll play devil's advocate to say both and. If you create it in here, you're not going to have a measure to reuse again for this month. So if it is something that you would actually use more than once, where you need just as an example here, I need sales in the current month, I would probably suggest just creating a measure in your model that is current month sales. That way you can reuse it again as kind of a best modeling practice. But I'm just showing you that you can apply with Q&A additional filters to a calculation that can then be put into the card, the text box that's in here. So I'll do a bit of formatting. There we go. So it actually shows up. And then as another recommended practice, because if you ever go to review, you'll get a list of all your calculations in there. It's usually recommended to give this some kind of a name, current month sales, something like that. And then it pops it into here. And if you wanted to, like I said, you can still actually have full, even though the number will constantly change, you can still underline it, italicize it, bold it if you wanted to. But my preference, at least for this, is just giving each dynamically changing value an underline, just to map them to each other. And then this was created just like in the last demo. Let me zoom out again. If I do the emoji keyboard, there we go. I like to just add some symbols occasionally next to the calculations. They're not necessary at all, but it sometimes just helps to break up the monotony of the chain, and it does draw the eyes a bit to, oh, there's a metric here. So I try to put those symbols next to just certain things that you might want to draw particular attention to initially, and call them out as maybe slightly more important. But otherwise, everything that I have in here, these are all just measures that I wrote in my model and brought into here. So I wanted to show you the implementation of that, and the, while not perfect design for putting the measures into it. I'm hoping at some point they get rid of the Q&A and just make it a bit simpler. But for today, that's just what you essentially have to work with. I'll do one more discussion just on a visual that's in here, and then I'll open it up for questions. So I'll start the conversation on the fact that this is a custom visual. I won't dive into the measures too much, but essentially what I have is I have two bars in here. One that is basically ignoring filters, and it allows it a comparison of grand total to subtotal. So I'll show you what I mean when I hover over this. So the green bar here is basically the equivalent of the entire bar behind it, and then whatever the blue bar is in there is just the basically the subtotal of the single element that I'm hovering over. So it just allows for a quick comparison to see like really how large is my value. There we go. Compared to the grand total, like, this one eats up a lot more of it. You can see when I hover over a much smaller section, it gives you just a different perspective to see how much it is. But what I like about this is that it's using a visual that just is not available out of the box in Power BI. It originally just got added in as something extra, so I could have a visual on my tooltip to go with the text box. But it ended up, I think, actually working out well as a good use case for custom visuals, because we don't have a bullet chart natively in Power BI, and there really isn't a visual that can do this out of the box. You can have ones where they're next to each other, but not anything that actually has the the overlaid bars like a bullet visual would. So it's a good use case to use them if you haven't explored the custom visual store that much. And most of the time you can access that pretty easily. I generally just go to the little ellipses that's over here, and if you get more visuals, it takes you to the marketplace. Now, I will say as a word of caution, like when needed, custom visuals are great when you have no other option but to use them, because there's just no way to configure or design a native visual in Power BI to do essentially the business requirements that you need for a particular visual. The downside, though, is they do run just a little bit slower. And the reason for this is a couple. So one, web browsers are single-threaded, meaning they load kind of sequentially all the elements that are basically being rendered on the report itself. Now, to help with that, native visuals can access each other's shared libraries for resources such as the common elements like the legend, the title. All of those basically can get cached once and then reloaded across those. So there's a bit of optimization for native visuals as they're loading to speed it up when you open a report and all the visuals are slowly loading onto your page. That actually has nothing to do with how fast your data is. That's just the web elements, the visual elements of the visuals needing to render just to display on the actual website when you're consuming it in the service. Now, custom visuals, for security reasons, they don't allow for like access of shared libraries. It's just a small security risk for any kind of data leakage and otherwise. So they load in a sandbox by themselves. So they basically have to render everything on their own, which usually means that they're maybe 10, 15% slower, not a lot. And if you have one on the page, you're never going to notice. If your report takes 3 seconds or less to boot up, essentially when you open the web page, it's noise at that point. But I have also seen people who have thrown a custom visual onto the page and nothing but custom visuals onto a page. So their entire report page is built with just lots of visuals, probably even more than they should use, period. And on top of that, a lot of them are custom. Like they have 15 or 20 custom visuals throughout the page. And then they want to know, why is this taking 7 to 10 seconds to load? It's because you're slowing it down with that. So use them sparingly. They have a lot of use cases, and the majority of my reports usually have a couple of custom visuals that are used on at least one page, but just don't go too trigger happy with them and deploy too many of them. So my general advice is, if you have a requirement that seems a little bit nuanced for the type of visual you're showing, see if there's any way you can achieve that through some combination of native visuals or layering or something. If it really is unachievable, then at that point, certainly go to explore custom visuals, but kind of consider them to be the exception, not the rule, when it comes to deploying reports. But otherwise, those are the 3 things that I just wanted to show into here. Using the button for the title, adding metrics to the text box in here, or at the bottom, just a good use case for one of the custom visuals that can be brought in onto this report tooltip page. So are there any questions on any of these 3 so far?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions, and
Sure.
One is from Klaus, who's asking, Danish language, I guess that's related to Q&A, is still not supported, isn't it?
Yeah, it's I'm actually curious. Let's see. They used to list it up here, but I would say objectively, I almost never use Q&A. It's one of those features that looks amazing for demos and presentations. It's like an MBAS when they show that like the HoloLens thing where look, you can walk around your office and you can like pin a report to this section. Like, who is actually ever going to use that? Yeah, it looks so cool. Same with Q&A. Like I can ask my computer a question and it gives me the chart for that. But at the end of the day, a well-built report should already provide everything. And the only people who normally want ad hoc analysis and want to make their own stuff aren't usually the executives who are consuming it in the first place. They want it to be built to their specifications. They don't want to ever have to do any work themselves to ask questions. So I've honestly, I think, only deployed Q&A on 3 different projects, and they were all Microsoft clients, like Microsoft projects for managers and stuff there. Outside, the report just gets built to spec, and then Q&A is never needed. But I think I don't know if you can look it up while I'm doing the demos, but there should be a page somewhere that shows a current running list of supported languages for Q&A.
Yeah, I will find it during the next. Okay. And then there's a question in the top product Q&A. Would you be able to show the product image if there was an image URL?
Yes. So
instead of a value. I would.
I'm just thinking of because there's the HTML viewer custom visual that I think it's Daniel Marsh-Patrick that makes that, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, it is.
Yes, and what that does is it can return a URL. So similar to like the Max product name that I was using just for the title in here. you could have a measure that, if you had on your product table, every single row for like product 1, product 2, there was a URL column that just had the URL in there. You could use the HTML viewer, and I can even maybe pull that up.
Yeah,
and
you can.
as long as the measure is fetching the single row of whatever that product ID is, then you could have the product image pop up into here as well. But
and you can specify a measure as a image URL.
Yes.
As a data category. So you can probably not put it in the Q&A or the smart narrative, but you would be able to put it.
Yeah, you would essentially do this. You just shrink that over, and you would put the HTML viewer right here.
Yeah.
The setting that you're talking about in a measure right there, you have an option to do web or image URL. So with a custom visual to view HTML, and it renders the images, and the measure harvesting it, you could very much just have a little card into here, and then it would just render whatever single item you have as you continuously move around like the visual. So very, very doable.
That was the questions for now.
Okay. See if I can have this actually up off screen. There we go. Okay, perfect. So close this. Do not save. There we are. Let me get the next one up. Let's see where you go. Here we go. More fun effects with buttons. You might notice that I really like buttons. I actually just created a new presentation, bedazzling your buttons and bookmarks. I wanted something that just, had a lot of bees in it. But there are so many ways to customize buttons. So I have a visual here that I've created with a few effects. It's actually one of my favorite cards to create and often put at the top of report pages. The reason I built this years ago, variations of this little card that we have here, is anything else that has a sparkline and a value that's shown usually is about like that big. Like it's normally a lot larger on the page. With Power BI, you have a canvas. It's kind of like a PowerPoint slide. You have limited space, so there's a bit of design that needs to go into fitting things small and compact. So I actually created a layered visual to minimize the white space and to achieve kind of this output. So I'm going to actually copy and paste this, and I'm going to show you in a second. But one thing you can already see in here, it might help if I remove lock objects. There we go. We actually have an alternative value that can show up upon hover. So that is actually using buttons and button states to achieve that. But I kind of can show 2 in 1. I can have in this case, there's basically a number. An arrow clearly is telling us that it's going up. I just anchored that to being for the current month, from the prior to this month, for that number, did it go up or down? It's less important about what the metrics are, again, as the feature. But then if you hover over it, you can actually see the percent. It went up 14% from the prior month. But basically, you could show a primary and alternative value on there. We also have something in the background that if I gotta find the right date for this. There we go. The background color changes depending on if we're going up or down. So I used the shadow to create a soft KPI color on the card itself. And then last but not least, I have on the axis in the bottom, I'm using a custom visual sparkline to then basically just create a trend below that. So let me kind of dissect this and go through each one of these one at a time. There we go. So separately, I had a card and I had the little sparkline. And what I've done with them is you actually have an option, Power BI, if you select things, you can either have them group or ungrouped. That was a feature that came out about a year and a half ago. But ever since then, it's just like in PowerPoint. It allows you to group objects, to move them around together, to associate them. So let me open up all the panes so we can kind of walk through this. So let's start with a card. So what that has is a couple of things in here. The shadow, that actually has an option, is I don't have to just display a single color. I can use the f of x symbol. And whenever you see that, I can actually supply a measure that has some type of a logic in it. So this is actually using a calculation called KPI color. So let me just show you that measure. It's fairly straightforward. There we go. Basically, the end result is whatever this calculation is, it's simply just looking, hey, is this calculation that I have, is it greater than or equal to 0? If that's the case, green, otherwise red. And I just have the 2 hex colors supplied right here that just determine the two colors to return. So I basically, in the measure, there's my logic of 1 of 2 hex colors to be returned, and I can push that into this element. I could have done this, by the way, with a background color. I could have done this with a title color. So there's actually a lot of different parts of this card or visual where I could have chosen to put that green. But I like the shadow just because it's, it was one of those ways that I think it was a good way to show the color indicator, but also not have it be obtrusive. Like if I was to change the entire background, it's a bit intense. I wanted a bit more subtle in this case. So I thought it was a clever way to utilize shadows to just give a hint about what the data is telling you. Now, the actual hover effect that you're seeing here is the fact that I'm using the button text, which I can have different text displayed for my default hover and press. So my default state has a measure being harvested here, which is just that number. Now, I will say that to display the information like this, it has to be converted to text. So the actual measure itself needs to be formatted because the only things that this will accept as a field have to be outputting some type of a text data type. So in this case, let me double check it's that one, okay. The end result down here is basically just a couple of formats. It's just formatting the page views, and then it's either showing the arrow down or the arrow up, depending on if that value is up or down for the current month. So that's just a couple of concatenations, less important about really what the measure is itself, as just what's needed to be done. And the thing that I mentioned is format. That has to be applied to it. If I was just to do it without that, even if the measure itself, cut this. So I think I need to do it to the top one. Here we go. It unfortunately does not inherit any of the formatting that comes from the measure. There you go. So even though the measure has been formatted, as soon as it converts it to text, it just puts it as flat characters in there. So you do need to wrap it in a format to get it to successfully convert and to keep the formatting that is in there. And that's basically the same thing I did to the other one. But now, because these, even though it looks like a number, it's basically a text string that allows me to then say, hey, for the button state, for this, for the default, return this value. For the on hover, that's the one where I have the current month value for the percentage. So it allows me to kind of create a primary and alternative value in there. And the nice thing is, because I have these alignment choices, I have the ability for the, there you go. Otherwise, it would have been in the center. I can move it up, which gives me that space down at the bottom to then be able to put the sparkling that's in here. That's the custom visual that I got from the store. That's just a free one, by the way, from OKViz. It's actually the people at SQL BI. They make a lot of really nice custom visuals, and I really just like a small sparkline in there, again, just to kind of show that general trend. But combined, in a very small footprint, you get a card that actually provides quite a lot of information. 2 different values, a KPI indicator with the shadow in the back, plus a trend line, all in like I said, a fairly compact space. So are there any questions on any of the techniques that I showed here?
Can you show your shading DAX again?
Yeah.
Say it again.
Can you show the DAX for the shading again? I wanted to look at something real quick.
Yeah, which one, for the number?
Yeah, for the number shading. The function.
Oh, for the oh, you mean for the background?
Yeah, for the background.
Okay, gotcha. Oops.
Yeah, that one.
There we go. Yeah, and it can accept hex. It can also accept RGB, and I think one other color type. I generally prefer text because that's what most things on the web do. But as long as you just have the values, and then that's the only things ever return, it will allow you to push it in. If you had a number or something else, when you tried to add it, it's just not going to let you assign that field. Like it automatically, when you are putting in these things, it will tell you what's available and what's not.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. There you go. You can see that like it's a little hard to tell, but like these ones, it won't let you click because it's not outputting a text value. But this one, so it knows what the measure is returning, and it basically says whether or not it is an acceptable measure or not in there. There you go. We'll see on that. Okay. Any other questions on this one?
Stella, could you unmute and perhaps tell us in detail what you mean by what about performance on report site?
What I mean is I have seen other guidelines where reducing cards and visuals on the side so to increase the performance. And I have a top line with key measures for my reports. So having all this visual on top of each other, it would affect the performance, I guess.
Yep, as long as you're under 3 to 4 seconds, it's fine. That's to me, that the golden rule that I've been taught and known for most people is by the time they like open the page, if it's only a few seconds for the page to load, it doesn't matter if you have more or less visuals. Once you start getting like 5 seconds plus, then yes, start to look at maybe reducing your cards, using other visuals that can combine cards, other techniques for that. But you know, in general, I've deployed this in plenty of reports. I have this on my Google Analytics one on my website, and that takes about 3 seconds to load, and then you slice and dice. So like it's not important that the number of visuals are on your page. The important part is how long does it take to load. That's the indicator of whether or not you need to optimize or not.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, no problem. All right, let me close this one. Okay. Perfect. Now this one's actually pretty straightforward, and it's also another great example of using or not using a custom visual. So I came across this one years ago when I was building out my website and my analytics for my website, and I saw on Google Analytics on their like primary landing page, they had this great heat map that was day of week, hour of day, and like, oh, I love this distribution. It's a really great way to see clustering and activity for traffic in a heat map scenario. And I knew that there's no actual heat map as a visual in Power BI. So my first thought was, all right, I'm going to go to get more visuals, and I'm going to go see what is available in the visuals store. And there is technically a couple of like table heat maps in here. This one I think is it's made by Microsoft, but it has not been updated in a very long time. And as you can see, it's not a particularly well-reviewed one. So there was a custom visual available for this, but I tried it and immediately just like, no, I don't like this. But then my next thought is, all right, well, wait, heat map table is quite literally just a grid with a bunch of cells colored into there. And I mean, what is that if not a matrix table? So I actually figured out how to format this with a few layers to turn it into that. So not only am I using a native visual, which will render faster, but I'm also there's a lot more options to customize and configure the native visual. So it's a pretty quick forward process for this, but it's one of my favorite little techniques to show that the tables in Power BI don't even have to remain a table. You can turn them into visuals. There's also been people I've seen like Adam Saxton and I think Phil Seamark who've cleverly used a table to actually create multi-row cards at the top where each cell is a different card number. And then with a bit of formatting and hiding the headers, you can turn it into a row of cards for the top of your page. There's a lot of really interesting ways to use the matrix table. But for this one, the thing that it taught me is that you don't have to just apply one level of formatting. So in here, if I go to conditional formatting and apply the background color, I'll start there. And let's pick some more neutral colors. How about a light blue, dark blue? There we go. Just applying that to the background. Was there a question?
Well, I think it was one that unmuted. So
yeah, that's fine. It's still kind of busy, and I would like to just be able to turn off the data labels. Now, personally, it would be nice if there was an option in here, like hide data labels, some checkbox on my background color to do that, or to color text too, something where I can do it all in one. But essentially the way to achieve that, again, it's one of those things where it's possible, but there's not a button that necessarily says to do that. But if you apply the same logic to the font color, so apply a second layer of conditional formatting. So same thing, light blue to dark blue. It essentially is giving you that effect. Because the background of the font's giving the same color logic, now they disappear into it, which is the effect that I want to achieve. The goal of a heat map is not to show the numbers, it's to show the patterns and the trends. And if I need the number, I can still hover over it. But it was a great way that I think it shows a great example of using a table as a visual, which is kind of a nice reframe, especially when you come from an Excel world where tables are just numbers. And it also shows that even though there's a custom visual for this, sometimes, ironically, a native visual can still do a better job than the custom visual that Microsoft built for this exact purpose. I think that was originally built back before you could do this amount of conditional formatting. That's also one of the reasons it hasn't been updated in a few years. But that is another thing to look at, by the way, is if you see a visual in here that doesn't have anything that mentions like updates or anything else, and or if you go to the documentation to check to see maybe the last time it was updated and it hasn't been around for 2 years, that hasn't been updated for 2 years, that might be a good indication that it might also just go away someday. Because at some point, Microsoft might update the code infrastructure for Power BI that I've seen on very rare instances, a custom visual breaks from that. If it's being actively maintained, it usually gets fixed really quickly. But if it's not being maintained, then that visual might now be broke forever. So it's just one caveat to consider when deploying those. But otherwise, are there any questions just on the conditional formatting or kind of transforming a table into a visual with the matrix table?
I guess no questions, but I have a small comment. If you want to build this, you need to remember to show items with no data, right? Otherwise,
yes.
If you don't have visits on Thursday.
Exactly. So what he's talking about is you select these here, show items with no data. What that does is it means that even if these are empty, it will still show it. The other important thing, which this is not actually doing, is right now, if I did that on my data table, if I filtered it out, these would still disappear. You actually need to make sure that these are coming from a dimension table, because that way when you filter, the data goes away, but you're not actually necessarily filtering out the values from your dimension table. It's a little nuance to explain without like going into a full demo on that, but it encourages the idea of that. Like I basically would have a separate table for my fact table that would have the list of these, usually for my calendar table, and I'd probably have a separate time dimension table of some type that would have the labels for all of these. But yeah, good call out, Eric. That is one that, like when I first built this, I'm like, oh yeah, I need a dimension table for these to make sure that the table doesn't collapse upon itself. All right. Any other questions before I close this and do? I think I'll do like
no further questions.
Okay. Let's see which one I'll do. Yeah, let's do this one. There we go. So this was a fun one to do. I did this more recently, and there's a little bit of kind of like intermediate DAX that goes into this that I'll try to explain as best I can. But essentially what I wanted to create is upper and lower bands in here to kind of show ranges. Like I wanted, I basically want to call out any data that is, 30% or lower. So if I drop that, you can see that shrinks. If I increase it, more of the KPI dots appear onto the page. So it allows me to adjust with the call out low ranges and with the call out high ranges. Same thing. If I drop it down to 50, it's basically showing everything from the 50% and above. But it gives me two ranges that can be adjusted, which then shows you the remaining values that fall above or below either of these ranges. And I went through a few iterations of this. I did this first, and the next one was, well, I kind of want a line that shows where these actual ranges are appearing. So then I figured out a way to include these little adjustable lines into there. And the final output, if we get to it, was one that actually had the colored lines that are in here to show the bands between the sections. I think I did this about 2 months ago, but it's all using native visuals, and for this one, a bit of clever layering. But I'm going to start from just the first one and talk about the measures that are being used in here. So let's go ahead and dissect this a little bit. Sorry. It's one of those, you feel like the smaller just sneeze a little bit. Okay, so in here, I'm going to actually convert this back to clustered column chart. There we go. And you can see that again, as a column, what it's doing is instead of the dots, it's calling out the bars. But now what I can actually do is come into here and I can show you the coloring that basically the measure that's being used into here and kind of walk you through how I was able to call out just some of the bars, not all of them. So again, with the f of x symbol indicated here, what that is saying is it is based on a field value, which is in this case high and low KPI colors. So let me show that one right here, and we'll talk about the measure itself. Basically, the end result being is what I ended up doing is I threw a couple of variables that are in here. I wanted to be able to determine mostly what's the max overall across any of these sections and what is the min. And I'm doing a max x function, basically creating a temp table, so to speak, that is in here that looks across every single one of these that are in here and determines what is my highest and what is my lowest. And then a couple of things to essentially convert that into the, and by the way, this file is downloadable. If you want, I can give you a link later to download this one. But I really just need to determine, based off of these two selections in here, is that falling above the high range or is that falling above the low range? And if either of those conditions are being met, it's either going to return the green or the red. But I basically have to myself figure out what the actual full range of the table is for the mins and the max, and then from there kind of convert that into a percentage based on this disconnected slicer that I have right here. Like I said, I could probably spend 25 minutes just talking about this, so I don't want to get into the weeds too much on the measure and dive into that rabbit hole as much as I'm really providing this, if you want to download, but showing you how this can be implemented into a visual itself. And that's what's being provided with these two into the visual. So these, if you've not used it before, are actually using a feature in Power BI called the what if scenarios. So essentially what this does is it creates a disconnected table that you create a range for. And in this case, it created two. I created a low range slicer and a high range slicer. And all that was is it was between 0 and 0.5% as a decimal and with an increment of like 0.1. So that's how I would have set up this range. I want my low range to be between 0% and upper bound of 50 with an increment of 0.1 or essentially, 0.01, which is 1%. So that's how I created each of these. And when you do that, what it does is it automatically provides a DAX generated table in your model, which has a single column. And I'll actually show you this in the data view. Right there. There you go. It just creates a single column table for you using the generate series function, and it takes your inputs. And hey, here's basically the range that I want to do, and it creates every one of those values. And it automatically as well creates a slicer, which is that thing that you saw in my KPI measure. It basically just grabs the selected value. So that's how that slicer goes from that column into this measure into right here. So that's how it's determining. Basically, it's like that metric percentage of range, which is just seen. Basically, it can calculate per column in that in the visual that we have here. That metric percentage of range is just determining is this is in the upper 95th percent of the overall range, or this is in the bottom 42%. Basically, now that calculation can just tell you based on the upper and lower range that we have as a percentage where this falls under between the two of them, and then it just says is it above or below either of those slices that I have, and if it is the case, then it returns either of those colors for green or red. So that's how it's able to color some of them, but not all of them, because otherwise, if these two conditions aren't met, there is no color being returned. It's null, which is why these ones still remain blue. It's the default color because there's no color logic being added to that. And then that beautifully translates over to that line that I was mentioning. Did I create a new one? Oh, I converted this slicer to a line chart. Here we go. One more time. And I'll put the stepped. I'm a huge fan of stepped. I just think it looks a lot better. But that's how we're able to get the two of those. So I'll actually, before I even show the other ones, if you even get time, but are there any questions about this that I can answer?
No questions, but Stella thinks it looks cool.
But yeah, I started with that, and I liked it from this perspective, but I definitely wanted a bit more clarity on calling out the band. So in this case, what I actually did, there we go. I believe, let me refresh myself one sec. Units, Interesting. There's something I think I'll do another demo because for some reason there should be a component in here for that helps me explain these, but it's not. Oh, that's right. Yes. I forgot that I did the layering in here. So what I've actually done with this is because there was no way for me to be able to add in this line in the value section here. I tried and attempted to do that, but it ended up with a lot of weird formatting that was coming through. For the icons basically ended up showing across this. So the way that I achieved this is, again, through some unique layering perspectives. What I actually have, if I open up my selection pane, if I open up the visual in here, you'll notice that there's actually a couple of objects in here. If I hide the top piece, I actually have a visual in the background that is providing just the bands in here. I'm going to go ahead and select that. And basically what I provided is just the actual high and low constant lines directly in this. So that's all it is doing, is just returning basically the whole value. Again, there's a couple of pieces in here, but the end result is it basically needs to know what that percentage is, and it's displaying that on the axis. And then I turned off everything else. I either colored white all of the elements to basically make it disappear, or disabled them. But through kind of sizing and everything and making sure that they're correctly on top of each other, it allows me to then have basically as a background object behind it the bands that are needed to adjust with that, since they're all based on the same values, and they have the same axis, by the way. So they will always maintain the same scale with each other, but it just allows for that extra line that really just helps you show the cutoff threshold. So that's why I wanted to add that into there, because this was somewhat informative, but it was still nice to be able to see where the actual cutoff line was. Because otherwise, between here and here, you knew that the line exists somewhere in there, but you still have to guesstimate, okay, the line probably is somewhere in this space, but I don't know the exact spot where it is being cut off. So this just added a bit more clarity to be able to have basically a second version of the exact same visual, but stacked behind it. And I will say, just as I mentioned, if you ever do layer visuals, there is one important thing to include, because historically there was an issue where something like this could happen. If you click on it too many times, it pops the visual as active, and then it hides the visuals that it was sitting behind, and it can look like it's broken. You can get around that as long as you have this function turned on. Any visuals that are in the background, as long as they are, one, in a group, because they have to be in a group for this to work, and two, if maintain layer order is turned on, when you publish it, then what happens is even if they click on a background object, it never shows up in front. It maintains the layer order. It does not have to be done for the items in the front, because they're already the frontmost visual. It's just the items in the far background that require that to be toggled. You can toggle it for the other two, it's just not going to do anything. But it's just one consideration to have, is if you ever layer visuals, for anything that's not the very frontmost visual, just make sure that the other two have that maintain layer order turned on. I think we're about good for time, so I'll skip the very last section, but in with the bands right here. Are there any other questions about the bands that we have? Otherwise, I can also open it up to general questions about Power BI and anything else that you might want to ask me.
There's no question about this one, but Rasmus, is there any way to make a Gantt style visual in Power BI?
I've not done one myself, but I've seen people do it with matrix tables. Again, like as long as you have the grid and you have usually like it's the whatever the project component, and then typically time, either day or month or something like that, because and the connected pieces. And I've seen people use it stacks and conditional formatting. Often like the conditional format bars or other stuff like that can pop in and basically create those for you. But I have seen it done with a matrix table. I also believe there are a couple of custom visuals that are designed to be Gantt charts, though I have not used those directly. But I did find it very interesting, the implementation of it just through the matrix table itself. I think Parker Stevens did one of those.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of custom visuals about Gantt charts, but some of them are paid, at least paid custom visuals.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you use the matrix, you will, and you have a long period, you need to format all the columns to make them smaller, and that is quite tedious.
Yeah, and there's not a quick and easy one, but I guess it's possible it either requires a custom visual or it looks like XViz actually makes one.
Yeah,
I actually didn't know that. They're one of my clients, so yeah. Okay, interesting. Yep. So I'll just actually, just if you're curious, I'll drop this in the chat window. I love all their other visuals. I've not used the Gantt one, but XViz makes them really, really cool. Them and Zebra BI, I would think, are probably the two best producers of like good quality but paid custom visuals for. Yep.
Evelina also asked whether you could show how you did the upper and lower coloring bands, but I guess that's also a layer issue, or.
It's basically the same thing. This is also a layered behind it. The difference is that this is a standard line chart for both of these. What I used on this one is I used the area chart, but I actually had to include the middle band. So basically, there's an area chart that's just that shows the range 0 to 100%, and I have 3 stacked lines on here. I can actually, I can show the this one if I, that is using the area chart, and I basically have these calculated and stacked. So this returns the bottom percentage, middle percentage, top percentage, and I just colored each one individually in here.
Yeah.
At the end, if you want, you can download this. I have this in my blog files section. So if you sign up for my blog, which is free, you get an email that just has the password that lets you into it, and there's probably like close to 100 different files between all of the YouTube videos that I've done that are available for download. So a large sandbox environment for downloading a lot of cool stuff.
Great.
Pull up. I'll have this up while people can ask some questions, and I'll have your link here in a second. But everything that you have that you might want as links are available here. I put the presentation PDF from every user group that I have up on my my website for speaking events. That QR code just takes you to my main website page. Also links in here for any type of services that I provide, like consulting and training. I also just released an online course on designing impactful reports in Power BI that's hosted on SkillWave, which is ran by Ken Pulse, Miguel Escobar, and Matt Allington, which are 3 other MVPs. And that's actually thankfully been selling like gangbusters, but it's a great 4-hour course on a lot of report layers and aesthetics and elements like that. I also just provide a 30% discount for anything files, services, and otherwise on my website, kind of as a thank you for just attending for the day. So that's available and it lasts for 1 month. If you like this stuff, I would encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. I produce videos every week on tips and tricks and tutorials in Power BI, and it just helps the views and the sharing. It helps for exposure, and it really just helps to drive the growth of the channel. And then if you have any questions, you're welcome to drop me something on LinkedIn. I'm happy to answer them. You know, if you have any curiosities or questions around Power BI or anything related to reporting or modeling or anything like that. I'll leave that up for a second and ask if there are any other questions.
Perfect. And if you could share that slide at least with me, I'll share it with the community as well.
I can also it pastes a little funky, but it's going to show up big. But there are all the links that are right there.
Perfect.
Just in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah. There was a question. There was 2 questions in the chat. Perhaps John, if you could unmute and raise your question. Or I can ask it.
Yes, sorry, I was a little slow.
No problem.
In Power Query, when you have the icon to expand a column of a related table. When you use Power Query online, it does not list the options to do an aggregation. So as opposed to expanding and showing, say, the sales table, you might want to just aggregate sales dollars, possibly.
Okay.
So in Power Query Online, you cannot do the aggregation, but in the regular Power Query, that is an option. Do you have any experience with that or workarounds or ideas along that line?
Well, 2 workarounds. Any query that is built in desktop will work in Power Query online. I'm actually surprised that isn't an option there. I've not experienced that myself, but if you built the query in desktop, just copied and pasted the M code right into a blank query in the service, it should run. So that includes then an aggregation option. So you can build it there and then just paste it right in. Alternatively, if you need to aggregate something to, like, let's say it's the company ID, and what you're trying to do is you're wanting to sum this value to the company ID level. If you do that first, in the query that you're merging with, do the aggregation there. And by the time you merge, then you can just simply say add the column because it's already been aggregated as a step in the other query. So those would be the two paths that I would suggest. Either just building it in desktop, copying and pasting right in to a blank query, and you have it there, or just doing it in a subquery, also in Power Query Online.
Oh, that's great. I didn't realize that you could copy the query from the desktop and that'll still work.
Yep, there's always going to be a couple of functions and buttons that aren't available usually in Power Query Online, but it has the engine is identical. So if it works in desktop, it will work in online. I don't believe there's any exceptions. Maybe you know one, Eric, but I think it's a complete 100% match between the two of them for the code. As long as the code runs in one, it will run in the other.
Okay, great.
There might be a few connectors that are not implemented in Power Query Online yet, but
yeah,
I believe that's only a few. But you can actually, in the query editor in the desktop, simply right-click your query, select copy, and then go into the browser and paste it into Power Query Online.
That's right. Yeah, they added that at some point.
Yeah. Yep, perfect. Thank you.
Ramon asks, do you want to raise your question as well?
Hi.
Hi.
I want to know if it's possible to create a dynamic content column by DAX for not to have so many visuals. That from a slicer, I can choose which column is represented in the visual. If for example, I have a sales amount, well, in the values, and I want to change the column for not have too many visuals in the report. I don't know if do you know what I mean?
So for instance, change from category to brand.
Yeah. For example,
the axis.
To brand to product, and you need not have different visuals. Okay, only to choose the slicer. Yeah, and the visual change and choose the other column. I don't know if it's possible, but it's a way that you have so many more or less visuals.
You would basically have to create like a DAX generated table that's on the single column would have to have unioned all the different values in it, and then probably multiple relationships back to the main table and some DAX that is. It's possible. It's not simple. I've seen people do that where you can change the axis dynamically through slicer selection, but you'd have to build a custom table with the data kind of unpivoted into certain columns and with some really unique relationships. I've seen people do it on videos, but it's not as simple. Just if this then that. Like you'd have to build out the model to specifically support that.
Oh,
I don't know what experience you have, Eric.
I put a link into Patrick example of how to do it in the chat.
Oh, there you go. Is that the?
As actually, and yeah, the kind of cube, or the other guy in the cube.
Patrick.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay. It looks like he did something a bit similar where he unpivoted and you have to create a custom table to do it essentially.
Yeah.
Awesome. By the way, there's a QR code from Eric for session evaluations. If you guys can do that, it's great. With any of these, it's very helpful for me always to get feedback. I'm constantly wanting to learn how to evolve my presentations and topics. So I very much welcome any feedback.
Yeah, I'll just put a link in the chat as well. This magic. That was perhaps if I put an HTTP in as well, that would help. Any more questions? Otherwise, yeah, that's apparently very hard to put in a URL in the chat, but I'll try again. That was not it. Otherwise, I will say again.
I think if you copy and paste, it works, but it just doesn't.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it works. Cool.
Here we go. Yeah, please evaluate and come with suggestions for future sessions that you could be interested in having in our group. Otherwise, thank you very much for spending an hour or more together with us, Reid. It was a pleasure, and I also learned a trick or two. So thank you very much.
Yeah, happy to to present. And then looks like we had like 42 plus people at one point. So everyone, thanks for taking time out of I'm assuming for most of you, your evenings. So thank you so much.
Good. Thank you, and have a great day.
All right, ciao.
Thanks.